Thank you very much, Mark. Before I introduce this afternoon's speaker, I'd like to just make a couple of announcements. The first is that I'm very grateful. When I was putting the Millercom proposal together, there was a very enthusiastic response from across the campus, and I'm very grateful for the many units on campus that co-sponsored this. You can find them listed on the flyer for today's talk. The other announcement is that at 6:15 at the Bread Company, just up the avenue, that way, whatever, okay. I do want you to come. I'm not deliberately pointing you in the wrong way. We will have a reception in honor of Rashid Khalidi. Please do come, and you'll have further opportunity to speak with him and enjoy the company of your colleagues as well. I'm delighted this afternoon to introduce to you an individual whom I've long admired for his scholarship, his commitments to public engagement, and his humanity. Since 2003, Rashid Khalidi has held the Edward Said Professorship of Arab Studies and the Directorship of the Middle East Institute at Columbia University. He has in the past been on the faculties of the University of Chicago, American University of Beirut, and the Lebanese University, as well as Georgetown University. In fact, today I think he was feeling nostalgic for those Chicago wins. He earned his BA from Yale University and his DPhil from Oxford University, completing his doctorate in 1974 under the supervision of Albert Harani, who was also one of my dissertation supervisors, which in Albert's inimitable and very sociable and expansive kinship model makes Rashid and me cousins of a sort, both members of the tribe of Aulad Albert. Rashid Khalidi's scholarship over the 3 decades since he earned his DPhil has centered on constructions of national identity, particularly in Palestine, and on the technologies of community, communication, and education that foster senses of national belonging, both among Palestinians and throughout other Arab societies. Equally, his scholarship has extended beyond the boundaries of nationhood, as Mark mentioned, to scrutinize the Arabic-speaking region as a site of great power interests and interventions, and that's been true since his DPhil dissertation on British policy toward Palestine and Syria in the decade before the eruption of World War I, published as a book by Ithaca Press in 1980. Professor Khalidi is author of 5 books and co-editor of 2 more, as well as author of more than 90 essays. His 2 latest authored books critically engage issues of consuming importance today: Resurrecting Empire, Western Footprints and America's Perilous Path in the Middle East, published in 2004, with a new edition already in 2005, which was written in the wake of 9/11, traces a history of European and American involvement in the Middle East, changing but persistent structures of global hegemony, and strategic geopolitical interests involved, as well, of course, the oil factor. Rashid Khalidi insists that consideration of alternative paths forward must be based on a careful and responsible reading of history, which is so often missing from public discourse in this country. The Iron Cage, the story of the Palestinian struggle for statehood, published in 2006, and as I understand from Rashid, quite long in the making, a book that he's been working on for a decade, takes up Palestinian history from the perspective of political institutions and civic citizenship, asking the difficult question of why Palestinians did not develop the kinds of institutions and structures of governance and cohesion that would lead internally to a viable nation state, even had external factors been more favorable. A native New Yorker, Rashid Khalidi's family roots do lie in Al-Quds, Jerusalem, a homeland which, as I've suggested above, he has continually revisited through his scholarship. No less is this the case with regards to his public speaking and media commentary. In addition to his academic prominence, Rashid Khalidi is a vigorous public intellectual, much sought after to explicate public policy debates in the US and globally. As a historian, he brings to public engagement an informed passion about teaching world histories to citizens of all ages, as something that he finds crucial, as I've already suggested, to the formation of a responsible polity. Rashid Khalidi has ever been a tireless speaker of reason, moderation, and historical depth on Middle East politics to the US public, and to various government organizations, appearing frequently as a commentator on NPR and elsewhere, writing op-eds for major newspapers, and speaking at venues as varied as the U.S. Naval Academy, the Jewish Theological Seminary, All Souls Church in New York, many a model UN, and many a local World Affairs Council. His books, which have most recently been published by Beacon Press in Boston, are written not only for scholarly consumption, but to reach out accessibly to a broader public, and they've been translated into Hebrew, Arabic, French, Italian, and Spanish. He has won many national and international awards, serves as a trustee or advisor to numerous projects, and was an advisor to the Palestinian delegation to the Madrid and Washington peace negotiations in the early 90s. His concern for public education has not been without its complications and difficult moments. As a public intellectual focusing on areas both mysterious and controversial to American audiences, he's faced considerable resistance, to put it rather euphemistically, from sectors of the U.S. political and media establishment, as well as from an interesting assortment of Beltway outliers. One need only go to the Rashid Khalidi entry on Wikipedia, which I did this week, and particularly, actually it's fascinating, particularly to the long and heated string of comments by a series of contending editors anxious to have the authoritative last word on who Rashid Khalidi is and what he stands for. One need only do this to recognize how his name, like that of Edward Said's, has become a flashpoint for what is perhaps the most controversial issue in U.S. and global politics now, or one of the most controversial, the future of Palestine, Israel, and the U.S. role therein. Simply because he is a highly informed and eloquent commentator on Israel-Palestine, he has earned the wrath of many who would rather maintain what has long been a public silence in this country on the plight and the fate of the Palestinians. Ironically, I wonder whether Rashid might appreciate this editor's quarrel on the discussion part of Wikipedia. For it's all about what counts as a historical source. In this case, what sources can be admitted to the public archive that stands behind the name Rashid Khalidi. But I don't suggest it as a source of information at all. We're very fortunate to have with us today not the archive, but the man. Not that archive, anyway. Building on his long record of scholarship on the historical roots of contemporary politics in the Middle East, Rashid Khalidi's latest research and his talk today ask us to consider the wider impact of that history on today's world. No citizen or resident of the U.S., indeed of the world, can ignore the interrelated impact for our small world of official U.S. involvement in the Middle East and the U.S.'s global role at the start of the 21st century. With public concern over U.S. engagement in Iraq at a height, with anxiety about our government's possible plans for Iran, and with ongoing violence across the region facing us every day on TV screens, it's crucial for every one of us to ask tough questions and perhaps to act on difficult answers. Rashid Khalidi challenges us to face those questions with knowledge and appreciation of the history that undergirds them in his talk today entitled Rethinking the Cold War in the Middle East. Please join me in welcoming Professor Rashid Khalidi to our campus.
Introduction. Thank you very much. After an introduction like that, almost anything is an anticlimax. So I apologize in advance if I don't live up to quite the spectacular billing that Marilyn has given me. It's a pleasure to be back in Illinois, where I lived happily for 16 years. The secret that people have discovered if they want to invite me places when I say I don't want to come is to be sure to be inviting me from a place near where one of my children lives. So since I have a daughter in Chicago, it was a snap for Marilyn to get me to come down to Urbana-Champaign, which is just a couple hours away. I go to some of the strangest places just because my kids are there. It's a pleasure to be at a place like this, which is, I actually enjoy being. My kids go all over the place, I promise you. I'm going to talk about a topic that is quite a ways away from whatever they may have been squabbling about on the Wikipedia, which I, in fact, was talking to students today about. I had no idea about this entry, and I'm going to do my damnedest never to look at it. I was talking to students today about the Wikipedia and damning it as a source of facts and real information. But what I'm going to talk about today is something that goes to the root of my own interests with the kinds of things that Marilyn mentioned, how external powers have affected this crucial part of the world and what that means. I'm going to be talking about rethinking the Cold War in the Middle East. And you are, in a sense, my guinea pigs, because this is the beginning of a new project for me, which I'm hoping to eventually produce in the form of a book. And I've talked about some aspects of what I hope will be that book in other venues, but this is the first time that I've given this talk, which forms part of the core of the argument that I'll be making. So I'm very eager to hear your reactions. If you find it a little rough at the edges, it's because it's literally the first time I've talked about this. And I hope you enjoy what I have to say. For nearly half a century, the Cold War rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union was like the frozen center of international politics. Its icy tentacles extended through most of the globe with often devastating effects. Its chill was felt in the domestic politics not only of the United States and the Soviet Union, but of countries the world over. The Cold War rivalry, we all know, is considered to have started immediately after World War II and very quickly became the central axis of international politics. Most people also know that even during the joint effort against Nazi Germany, this rivalry was already presaged, was already beginning in some ways with wartime suspicions and maneuvers among the Allies. As early as 1944 and 45, Churchill in particular was beginning to think about how to oppose Soviet power. It's not a coincidence that Churchill's speech in Fulton, Missouri on the Iron Curtain coming down across Europe should have been the signal for the launching of the Cold War and given us one of its most important metaphors. Churchill was thinking about this much earlier than many others. Thereafter, as I think it could be argued with Stalin, by the way, thereafter, the East-West confrontation dominated deliberations at the newly established United Nations, which its founders thought would prevent this kind of international situation in the future, and it aggravated pre-existing local conflicts or produced new ones in virtually every region of the world. Now, the Cold War and the fears it engendered haunted several generations. I remember in public school in Mount Vernon in New York going under the desk as part of a drill because the Soviets were going to bomb us back in the 50s. It didn't haunt me, but I remember it. It had this impact not only in the United States and the Soviet Union, and in Europe, which at the end of the Second World War lay prostrate between the victorious armies of the two superpowers, and also in East Asia and South Asia. Notably, in Korea and Vietnam, the Cold War developed into ferocious hot wars, the only such wars throughout the entire period of the Cold War which directly involved the United States and communist allies of the Soviet Union. The rest of it was a Cold War. But there were also other, less overt proxy confrontations between the superpowers in Central America and the Caribbean, in Africa, in the Middle East, and in South Asia, all of which became important arenas for decades of superpower rivalry. Now, the Cold War has been over for more than a decade and a half. That's a very long time. I learned this on an airplane sitting next to a young woman, and I mentioned the Vietnam War. She didn't know what I was talking about. And it turned out that her brother had been wounded and mentally damaged by Vietnam, but she really didn't know anything about the Vietnam War, and this was less than 10 years after it ended. It's only 15 or 16 years ago, but for students entering college today, the Cold War is beyond their experience, beyond their memory, and if they know anything about it at all, which may or may not be the case, it is at best a matter of dim, distant history. And yet, if times fly, or time flies, changes in the way we see history progress very slowly. This can be especially true of recent history about which many people who have lived through the events in question may have deeply felt views which they are reluctant, sometimes deeply reluctant, to modify. Thus, a serious rethinking of this crucial period of modern world history, free of Cold War shibboleths and of the partisanship that distorted so much earlier scholarship, has not really taken off. There has been some, but not, I think, enough. This is especially true on the winning side. It's It's not true in Russia. In Russia, they've reassessed everything, every aspect of Russian and Soviet history. But on the winning side, on our side, it is especially true. And it is the case that certain aspects of the orthodox, long accepted interpretation of this conflict have yet to be rethought. Indeed, the continuing identification of many older Cold War historians with the received truths on their side of the Iron Curtain has been a hindrance to the writing of serious, objective history of the Cold War. There is thus, though there is some very good stuff beginning to come out, there is thus a need for a revised view of the broader story of the origins, development, and courses of the Cold War and of its effects. Beyond this need for general revisionist Cold War history, relatively little new research has been done about the central role of this great international rivalry in a number of regional conflicts. This follows on a period from the late 50s through the early 90s when a great deal of scholarship, some of it in political science, some in history, some in other disciplines, and much of it policy-driven, was devoted to exploring the impact of the Cold War on these regions. In other words, during the Cold War, there was a lot of work being done on the impact of the Soviet-American rivalry in Africa or Asia or whatever. A whole field, Sovietology, grew up in the shadow of the Cold War and has now virtually disappeared. There's been a similar drop in the number of such works in various Cold War-related fields in recent decades. Ironically, this has come just as a bit of distance in time has developed between us and many of the most dramatic events of the Cold War, making the writing of history of this period in some ways easier. Now, this relative paucity of new scholarly work on this period is as true of the Middle East as it is of most of the regions that were deeply marked by the impact of the Cold War from the 40s until the 90s and have been marked further since then by what might be called the ghosts of the Cold War. One of those ghosts is Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda, and I'll explain why he is, in a sense, a ghost of the Cold War. In this lecture, I will seek to explore some aspects of that impact and its possible after effects long after the Soviet Union itself had disappeared. Now, there are a number of reasons why it's important, in my view at least, to revisit this period. Immediately subsequent to the sudden disappearance of its Soviet rival in 1990-1991, the United States engaged in an extraordinarily confident assertion of its now unrivaled, untrammeled, unchallenged power in the Middle East via its leadership in the First Gulf War and at the Madrid Peace Conference. Both were completely unprecedented initiatives in various ways. The First Gulf War was the first American land war in Asia since Vietnam, and the first major American military intervention in the Middle East against a Middle Eastern power. Obviously, the United States was there against the Barbary pirates, I would argue, a minor episode. And obviously, the United States was engaged on the ground in the Middle East in the Second World War. But this was the first American land war in Asia against an Asian power since Vietnam. Madrid was radical in a number of ways. Most importantly, it was the first multilateral Arab-Israeli peace conference in history. No power had ever succeeded in bringing all the parties to the same table before, and it hasn't happened since. So both of these were radical departures. In light of these, apparently at least, radical departures, it would be useful, I think, to revise our understanding of the Cold War as no more than a prolegomena, a sort of introduction to the current era of unfettered American domination over the Middle East. Was, in fact, the United States as constrained as it seemed to be by the presence of its Soviet rival, as these two novel departures immediately after the Soviet Union disappeared seem to indicate? Or was America, in fact, more dominant in the Middle East throughout the Cold War era, and obviously afterwards, than may have appeared at the time? I think these are important questions, since for the United States, the Cold War was at least ostensibly the reason for the extraordinarily expanded American post-World War II presence. The Soviet threat was the pretext for our having military bases spanning the globe. It was the reason why we developed an enormously expanded intelligence capability, enormously expanded economic involvement in the world, a vastly expanded diplomatic profile compared to the relatively modest world role of the United States before December 7th, 1941. We are so used to the enormous state which grew out of World War II and was nourished by the Cold War that we forget that we didn't even have an intelligence service when Pearl Harbor happened. The person whose job I initially took when I went to Columbia as a visiting professor in 1985, J.C. Hurwitz, told me that when he took over the job at the OSS of the Palestine desk, meaning he would be the person who dealt with Palestine. He said, where are our archives? Where is our institutional memory? He was shown to a filing cabinet. In that filing cabinet, there were two pamphlets, one on the Arabs, one on the Jews. That was the sum total of the institutional knowledge of the United States government during World War II on this question. We did not even have an intelligence service before World War II. We did not have bases anywhere except those tiny colonies, Hawaii, Philippines, the Caribbean. We had fleets, we had a huge international economic presence, but we did not have the kind of reach that the United States has taken for granted ever since World War II began. So the Cold War, following on World War II, was the pretext for all of this. And it's worthwhile to remember what I'm about to say, because the post-war expansion of American power after World War II contrasted strikingly with the isolationist aftermath of World War I. And this post-World War II expansion was largely predicated on the newly found need to confront the Soviet Union. In many areas, this meant that the wartime arrival of US troops, in the case of the Middle East, this took place in North Africa and Iran in 1942, since which time we have not had a moment when there were not US troops somewhere in the Middle East. The arrival of US troops was not followed by the end of the war, after the end of the war, by their disappearance back over the horizon, as had happened in Europe immediately after World War I. In other words, we arrived in World War II, and we've stayed ever since, at least in the Middle East. These initial wartime deployments of US forces, and later the establishment and post-war maintenance of US air bases in Dhahran in Saudi Arabia, at Willis Field in Libya, where my brother was born, as well as in Morocco, in Turkey, and elsewhere, marked the beginning of what is by now a well-established role for the United States as a major Middle Eastern power. Indeed, I'm arguing today that these early post-war moves constituted the beginning of an American role as the major Middle Eastern power. Although it was overshadowed at times by other Cold War arenas, the Middle East was not just another region where the United States and the Soviet Union contended. Because of its central geographic location, even before oil had been discovered, because as well of its energy reserves, the energy reserves it was known to contain long before World War II, the crucial strategic importance of the Middle East had been amply demonstrated during that war. This strategic importance was further established during the Cold War and has been shown again since the Cold War ended. Indeed, the region's importance to this country has only seemed to increase with every passing year since the end of the Cold War. Evidence for this assertion can be found in a series of major American initiatives. These included the already mentioned defeat of Iraq in '91 in the first Gulf War, the '91 to '93 Madrid-Oslo peace process and its sequels through 2000, as well as the Iraq sanctions regime for almost a decade, and the invasion and occupation of Iraq starting in 2003, an occupation which I would remind you is now in its 5th year. Some of these American actions were unilateral in essence, even if superficially multilateral in form. The United States did these things essentially alone. Others emerged more genuinely from collective decision-making in the United Nations and elsewhere. In any case, these initiatives in the Middle East have been among the most dramatic actions taken by the United States in the world arena since the collapse of European communism and the end of the Cold War. Another reason why I think we should look at this region. Given all of these facts, a re-examination of the Cold War in the Middle East has ample potential to clarify at least two issues, which are linked to a number of questions. And let me lay these out for you. I'll try and answer them by the end of the lecture. The first of these issues is to provide the immediate background for understanding the current unprecedented American involvement in this region. How did this country get into the situation in which it finds itself today with a huge military, political, and economic presence in this unstable region of the world where we are currently fighting two wars, in Iraq and Afghanistan, and may or may not be on the verge of a third war with Iran? How did we get here? Does this posture indeed have its roots in decades of deepening involvement in this region linked to the rivalry with the Soviet Union? Or are there alternative or supplementary explanations for this massive presence? That's the first issue and the questions related to it. The second is to deepen our understanding of the transformation of the role of the United States from being essentially a Western Hemisphere and Pacific power before World War II to its current position as sole global hegemon. Is explaining the growth of America's involvement in the Middle East crucial to our understanding of the United States' new post-war global role? In other words, is the Middle East particularly important to understanding this? And finally, to what extent is today's massive American involvement in the Middle East an aberration, the most egregious of the much deplored foreign policy excesses of the Bush administration? Or does it mark a pattern likely to continue into the future, whether because of the extraordinary importance of the Middle East itself, or because a sort of inertia will lead to a continuing massive American presence in that region? Now, those are the basic questions I want to try and answer, or at least lay out for you. In considering the answers to all of these questions, I think it's useful to start with a little appreciated event near the very end of World War II. This was a meeting between President Franklin D. Roosevelt, in whose administration the Illini Union building was erected. I just noticed that. That's where I'm staying. This was a meeting between President Roosevelt and the Saudi king, Abdulaziz ibn Saud, on the deck of the cruiser USS Quincy in the Great Bitter Lake in Egypt's Suez Canal on February 12, 1945. The president, you can tell from the pictures, was gravely ill, and he was only 2 months away from his death. He was on his way home from the Yalta Conference, at which the post-war distribution of the world was decided. Sick though the man was, busy though he undoubtedly was, this meeting was nevertheless arranged because of Saudi Arabia's importance in the eyes of those in the State Department, the military, and the OSS, which was the wartime predecessor of the CIA, who were already planning for the post-war era. This had nothing to do with the war. This had to do with the post-war. The organizer of the 1945 meeting, a man named Colonel William Eddy, was the head of the American legation in Jeddah, which is where our diplomatic representation was in those days. He was an Arabic-speaking son of missionaries, lived in Cairo, Beirut, all over the Arab world, who is described in his semi-authorized biography as a key figure in General Bill Donovan's wartime intelligence service, the OSS. We know that by this point, the vast extent of Saudi oil reserves was familiar to American strategic planners and American oil executives, who were often the same people, shades of Vice President Cheney's secret 2001 Energy Commission. Saudi oil had for several years been flowing to support the Allied war effort, an effort which was simultaneously strangling both German and Japanese oil supplies, measurably shortening the war. In fact, the strategic bombing of the United States Army Air Force in World War II in the European theater was largely directed at strategic targets, most importantly, oil. The reason we defeated the Germans as quickly as we did was because, among other things, the US Army Air Force basically prevented the Panzers and and the Luftwaffe from moving. They didn't have fuel. That's why and how the war was won as quickly as it was. The Royal Air Force, incidentally, refused to do this. They bombed cities, which did nothing, as far as can be told, to hasten the end of the war. But the US Army Air Force focused on ploesti, synthetic oil manufacturing, and so on. So while we were getting oil from the Middle East, the Germans and the Japanese were having their oil supplies strangled. Finally, in 1945, the United States was already making use of a major air base at Dhahran, which the United States Air Force was to continue using until 1962, and then again for a decade, starting 30 years after that, right at the beginning of the first Gulf War. The United States and Britain had by this stage already launched major invasions of Sicily, then of Italy, and then of southern France from bases in the Middle East. And they were supplying huge quantities of equipment to the Soviet Union across Iran, which had been occupied in 1941 by British, Soviet, and then in 1942 American troops. Saudi Arabia was only one link in this vast wartime chain, but it had one crucial characteristic besides its possession of vast reservoirs of oil and gas. This was the fact that it was one of only two fully independent Middle Eastern states that were not occupied by the troops of European colonial powers. Moreover, 12 years earlier, Ibn Saud had signed an exclusive agreement for the exploration and exploitation of the kingdom's oil reserves with a group of major American oil companies. President Roosevelt was thus meeting with the absolute ruler of a nation with something unique to offer the United States. This was an alliance with a Middle Eastern power that was not already part of another great power's sphere of influence, something which gave American access to oil and bases even more meaning. Moreover, importantly for the coming post-war era and for the Cold War, Saudi Arabia's ruler was staunchly anti-communist, and he did not have to worry about a large body of nationalist public opinion, as did governments in major countries like Egypt, Iraq, Syria, and Iran, where large urban populations organized into political parties, enjoying slowly growing literacy and attached to a culture of newspapers and books, were already deeply anti-colonial. They didn't have these things in Saudi Arabia. Nevertheless, because of the king's concern about his standing both in the Arab world and with public opinion in his own kingdom, however rudimentary it may have been, Abdulaziz did tell the president that, happy though he was to cooperate with the United States in a variety of spheres, he insisted on the importance of one issue. This was the issue of Palestine. In response, we don't know precisely what the president said to him. We have this from the accounts that we have from Colonel Eddy and others, Saudi and American sources. In response to this expression of the king's concerns, in April 1945, about a day before the president died, actually, he sent a letter to Ibn Saud confirming that the United States would consult with both Arabs and Jews before acting in Palestine, where he said it would never act against the interests of the Arabs. This was President Roosevelt's April 12th letter to Ibn Saud. Roosevelt's successor, Harry Truman, was to deny publicly that the United States had ever made such commitments. And although he was later provided with Roosevelt's April 1945 letter by the State Department, Truman proceeded to violate both of these commitments in the Palestine policy that he crafted over the next few years. The issue of Palestine was to be a continuing irritant to the Saudi monarchy in its dealings with Washington, and is so down to the present day. But it is an irritant which that monarchy has come to accept as the price of doing business with the indispensable power of the United States. Ibn Saud, I've already mentioned, in 1933 had given the original oil concession to an American company, Standard Oil of California, which thereupon formed a consortium of companies that became Aramco, the Arabian American oil company, which has since been nationalized as Saudi Aramco. With this oil deal of 1933, with the commercial production of oil in 1938, with this alliance, the king managed to assert his independence of Great Britain's heretofore exclusive influence over his kingdom, which he had much resented. When the British had him under his thumb, they made him do what they wanted. Now he was free of their grip. However, whether far-sighted, lucky, or both, Ibn Saud managed to link his realm to the growing power of the United States long before most world statesmen realized the future superpower's full potential, back in 1933. From the American perspective, Saudi Arabia was seen as important to American post-war planning in terms of both its strategic and economic value, and it showed this in the subsequent years. Saudi oil produced by Aramco was crucial to the post-war recovery of Europe. It was crucial to keeping oil prices extremely low for several decades after World War II. It hovered between $1 and $2 a barrel, if you can believe that, for decades. And it was crucial to the profits of the American oil companies that dominated the world oil market. The Dhahran air base was particularly useful to American global airlift capabilities and as a link in a chain of bases strategically located along the Soviet southern frontiers, particularly in the early decades of the Cold War when American aircraft had more limited ranges. The U.S. Air Force ceased to need the base in the early 60s when the development of longer-range weapon systems made it possible to give up a variety of American bases, including Dhahran and those that were used for Jupiter intermediate-range ballistic missiles in Turkey, Britain, and other countries. Now, as the Cold War penetrated the Middle East, and as the United States replaced Britain and France as the dominant Western powers in the region, the American-Saudi connection was cemented in 1957 by the adherence of King Saud, who had succeeded his father, to the Eisenhower Doctrine. His acceptance of the Eisenhower Doctrine, in other words, was another acquisition. The Eisenhower Doctrine had proclaimed American support for any Middle Eastern government that was targeted by international communism. This was a major coup for the United States, which thereby separated Saudi Arabia from its erstwhile ally in inter-Arab politics, Egypt. Soon, Saudi Arabia, and it continued. This was something that continued to give benefits. Soon, Saudi Arabia's value to the United States was to emerge in yet another sphere, the ideological. For one of the key convergences of the Cold War era in the Middle East was that between the Soviet Union and leftist and Arab nationalist movements in their various forms, including Nasserism, the Ba'ath Party, Arab socialism, various Arab communist parties, and other leftist parties and groups. Although it was united by anti-colonialism and by some other shared values, this was in fact a profoundly uneasy coalition. There were deep divergences, there were profound suspicions, and there were sometimes open conflicts between the various component parts of this coalition, and between many of these parties and the Arab regimes they came to dominate on the one hand, and between the Soviet Union on the other. Nevertheless, for a time, in the late 50s through the early 70s, this appeared to be a formidable coalition between the Soviet Union and these leftist and nationalist Arab parties and regimes. Indeed, in the struggle which the late Malcolm Kerr memorably described as the Arab Cold War, this coalition seemed to be the winning one, as it proclaimed that it represented the future in the struggle against the backwardness of the assorted traditional monarchies and conservative regimes that were associated with the United States. What the Saudi monarchy brought to this apparently unbalanced situation, which on the face of it seemed highly unfavorable to the United States and its allies, was the ideological weapon of Islam. This Saudi Arabia was uniquely positioned to do, given the centuries-old alliance between the Saudi royal family and the rigidly orthodox Wahhabi religious establishment, and given the kingdom's special place as the location of two of the three most holy places in Islam, Mecca and Medina. Particularly, once the much more competent and much more ostensibly pious King Faisal had taken over from his dissolute, profligate older brother, King Saud, in 1962, Saudi Arabia focused on Islam as the backbone of its resistance to the self-proclaimed progressive Arab regimes. Saudi Arabia sponsored various pan-Islamic entities, among them what became the Organization of the Islamic Conference, as a counterweight to various pan-Arab bodies promoted by Egypt. It spent its oil wealth liberally on propagating the kingdom's puritanical Wahhabi form of Islam, and it gave refuge to Islamist political activists persecuted by secular Arab nationalist regimes in Egypt, Syria, Iraq, and elsewhere, notably activists from the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, Saudi Arabia's employment of Islam as an ideological tool starting in the early 60s was a major addition to the arsenal of the United States and its allies among the conservative forces in the Arab and Islamic worlds. And it was particularly important because these forces were at this time largely on the defensive. It was an important addition, but as we'll see, this new weapon produced some of its fruits, including some very bitter ones, only much later, long after the Cold War was over. In the 60s, however, this tool was particularly crucial in rallying the conservative forces, coming as it did at the height of the civil war in Yemen, in which Egyptian troops and air power backed the Republicans, and Saudi Arabia supported the royalists in a desperate seesaw struggle on the southern borders of the Saudi kingdom. Islam and American backing became the cement which brought together a disparate coalition, including Yemeni royalist and tribalist forces, the governments of Jordan and Oman, which faced their own domestic radical oppositions, and further afield, the governments of Pakistan and Iran, as well as other governments and parties, including elements of the now underground Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, Syria, and Iraq. In their proclaimed defense of Islamic principles against atheistic communism and its secular Arab nationalist allies, there was now a rallying point that was to prove a lasting focus for the forces aligned with the United States in the region. It was to continue to play an important role in American, Saudi, and Pakistani regional policies, that is to say, Islam, through the Afghan War of the 1980s, long after the high tide of radical Arab nationalism had ebbed in the wake of the crushing defeat inflicted by Israel on two of that ideology's leading paragons, the regimes of Egypt and Syria, in June '67. I'm going to return again to the Afghanistan experience. Now, the Arab Cold War, which in fact was part, I would argue, of the larger American-Soviet Cold War, was only one example of the important ways in which that larger Cold War had an impact on the Middle East. The identification of each of the superpowers with one or another side of the Arab-Israeli conflict was another aspect of this. For decades, until the Cold War ended, the United States, as we all know, was the primary backer of Israel, and the Soviet Union, as we all know, was the main supporter of most of the Arab states engaged in that conflict. We tend to forget, but this identification did not go back to the earliest phase of that conflict, the Palestine War of 47 to 49. In fact, in that crucial war, in that whole period, both the United States and the Soviets were ranged on the same side. They both voted in the UN General Assembly in November 1947 to give the Jewish minority in Palestine 55% of the country. They both raced to recognize the new Israeli state that resulted from that decision on May 15, 1948, and they both helped surreptitiously to arm Israel during the war that ensued. Thereafter, Britain and France became the main arms suppliers to Israel, which used their Centurion and AMX-13 tanks and their Super Mystère and Mirage fighters to win its next two wars. The first war, an alliance with Britain and France in 1956, and the second in 1967. Now, this tripartite Anglo-French-Israeli invasion of Egypt in 1956 marked another moment when, far from being ranged on the same side as they were for most of the Cold War, the US and the USSR found themselves strange bedfellows on the same side, both opposing the aggression of the two old colonial powers and their Israeli ally against Egypt. This came at one of the high points of the Cold War, when Soviet forces were engaged in bloodily suppressing the Hungarian uprising, and the United States and the Western powers were loudly decrying Soviet brutality. But over Suez, the two superpowers took the same position, albeit for different reasons. The Soviets were happy to be able to point to Western imperialist aggression while they put down a rising in their own imperial backyard, while President Eisenhower was absolutely furious at Britain and France for acting without consultation, for doing so with overtly neo-colonial motives, and for distracting world public opinion from Soviet bad behavior in Eastern Europe. This was to be the last time, until the end of the Cold War, that the superpowers were on the same side of the Arab-Israeli conflict. Soon thereafter, the Eisenhower administration's sympathy for the Egyptian regime of Gamal Abdel Nasser, which was never very deep, was exhausted, and the Cold War ratcheted up even further in the Middle East. I've talked about the Eisenhower Doctrine of 1957. The Soviet Union had been supplying Egypt with arms since 1955 and soon was supplying Syria, Iraq, and other Arab countries. The United States was arming Saudi Arabia, Iran, Jordan, and other allies. At the same time, under Eisenhower, the United States surreptitiously allowed West Germany to ship surplus American-manufactured M48 tanks to Israel, an arms supply relationship that became more overt in the subsequent administrations of John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. The former sent Hawk anti-aircraft missiles, and the latter sent A-4 Skyhawk attack bombers to Israel. Historians now pretty much agree that it was the '67 war which marked the full alignment of the United States and Israel and of the Arab states and the Soviet Union, and the beginning of Israel's heavy reliance on American weapon systems, starting with the F-4 Phantoms that were supplied by the Nixon administration immediately after the '67 war. The massive dependence of Israel on billions of dollars in U.S. aid annually came a few years later, following the '73 war. By this time, the United States had come to see Israel as its most valuable ally in the Middle East, in the global struggle with the USSR and its proxies. This had very little to do, in American eyes, by the way, with the merits of the conflict, and everything to do with the Cold War. Obsessed by a scenario in which they saw the USSR and China as pinning the United States down in Southeast Asia at little cost to themselves via their Vietnamese proxies, the Johnson and Nixon administrations looked to Israel to even the score against the Soviet-backed regimes of Egypt and Syria at little cost to the United States. It was a quid pro quo. The two superpowers raised the stakes higher and higher, starting with the '67 war, and then in the strategically crucial '68 to '70 war of attrition along the Suez Canal, in which Soviet air defense crews and pilots were directly engaged in combat with the Israelis, and then finally in the '73 war. Both progressively sent their allies more and more advanced weaponry and became more directly committed themselves. The Soviets with huge numbers of advisors, tens of thousands of advisors in particular. This reached the point of the United States going to a general nuclear alert, DEFCON 3, in the final stages of the '73 war in response to reports that Soviet paratroop divisions had been placed on alert and that the USSR was shipping nuclear warheads to its forces in the Mediterranean. Now, by this point, by 1973, the Cold War rivalry, as played out through the Arab-Israeli conflict, had taken on a dynamic of its own. This can be seen in the behavior of Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger, who by 1973 was Secretary of State, and in the actions of their Soviet opposite numbers. Nixon and Kissinger's objective, and Kissinger says this explicitly in his memoirs, and his main objective was to expel the Soviets from Egypt and to win that country over to the side of the United States. An objective that incidentally fitted perfectly with the aims of Egyptian President Anwar Sadat. The Soviets' aim was to retain their foothold in the region at all costs. And I will come back and talk about why the region was so strategically important to both when I talk a little about about the strategic weapon systems that were involved. That was what it was really all about. I'll talk about that in a second. For both superpowers, these aims were more important than the Arab-Israeli conflict itself or than peace between Arabs and Israelis. In consequence, and much more important, I mean, the rivalry was everything. Peace was as nothing. They really didn't care about that. They cared about winning the wars, i.e. letting their proxies win, but they cared about gaining advantage at the expense of their rival. In consequence, the conflict came no closer to final resolution. This was in spite of 3 disengagement agreements that were negotiated by Henry Kissinger, one of which created a situation between Israel and Syria that's lasted really since 1974 without any change. This is in spite of the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty that emerged after President Carter's mediation at Camp David, and in spite of many other efforts. In other words, achieving advantage in their rivalry with one another was more important to the superpowers than peace in the Middle East, which consequently got relatively low priority in their efforts in the region and has not been achieved to this day, as we all know. There are numerous other instances of how the overarching Cold War rivalry shaped and distorted outcomes in the Middle East. Decisions on economic development, decisions on domestic policies, the balance of forces between political parties in the region, and many other things were affected by the machinations of the Soviets and the Americans in their unceasing rivalry with one another. The tragic example of how the Kurds in Iran, in Iraq, and in Turkey became pawns in regional rivalries that came to be overlaid with the confrontation between the superpowers is one among many of these subplots. This sad story didn't start with Saddam Hussein. I'm terribly sorry to tell you that. That's the end, not the end of it, but that's the middle point of it. It starts with the proclamation of the Kurdish Mahabad Republic in northern Iran in 1945. It continues through the betrayal of the Kurds in the 1975 Algiers deal between Iran and Iraq. And it continues through the slaughter of Kurdish villagers in the course of the Iran-Iraq War of 1979 to 88, mainly by the Iraqi army, of course, in which the superpowers played both sides of the street in their unceasing effort to gain advantage over one another. Thus, the United States and its allies encouraged Iraq to go to war with the Islamic revolutionary regime in Iran, supplying Iraq with the means to engage in gas warfare, including the gas that was used against the Kurds. While the Reagan administration later surreptitiously contacted Iran as part of the illegal Iran-Contra conspiracy, promising to deliver parts for Hawk missiles to the Iranians, who were desperate to get these missiles going to be able to shoot down Iraqi planes that were bombing their cities. The Soviets, meanwhile, were the main suppliers of the Iraqi armed forces. The artillery and the bombers that dropped this gas were Soviet bombers and Soviet guns. But the Soviets, quite even-handedly, also sold armored vehicles and missiles to the Iranians. Even as the Iran-Iraq war was starting, the Soviet Union made a fateful and ultimately fatal decision to send its forces into Afghanistan to prop up a crumbling pro-Soviet regime. We all know the rest of the story. The Carter administration decided to respond vigorously by supplying anti-Soviet Afghan guerrillas, the Mujahideen, in a bid to bleed the Soviets. But Carter was succeeded by Reagan, whose administration saw in Afghanistan an opportunity to bring down the entire evil empire. Not just bleed them, destroy them. Activating its old Pakistani and Saudi allies and groups which had worked with them in various nooks and crannies of the Cold War and the Arab Cold War, as well as others from all over the Arab and Islamic worlds, the CIA, with the support of the Saudi and Pakistani intelligence service, soon helped to field a well-armed and supplied force of Afghans and Arabs who were more than a match for the Soviet occupation forces and their Afghan allies. After they won, and after the bloodied and defeated Red Army crossed the mountain passes back to the Soviet Union in 1988, the movement created by these cold warriors eventually fractured and metastasized into forces which engaged in the endless war that engulfed Afghanistan and that still engulfs Afghanistan, and others which developed into Al-Qaeda. This is what I mean when I talk about the ghosts of the Cold War. These people had their direct origins in the last, very last phase of the Cold War in the Middle East. Soon after the Soviets were defeated in Afghanistan, and soon after the Iran-Iraq War ended in mutual exhaustion, the Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe began to crumble from within, and the Soviet Union followed it very soon thereafter. The Cold War was over, but its tragic sequels, its toxic debris, and its unexploded mines continued to cause massive harm until the present day. I mean this both literally and as a metaphor. Let me conclude. I think I may have tried your patience, but I still have a little more. Let me conclude by trying to respond to some of the questions I posed at the outset of this talk. Was the Cold War in the Middle East no more than a prolegomena to the current unfettered hegemony over the region and the rest of the world that the United States was only able to exercise once the Soviet Union was out of the way? Or was the power of the Soviet Union exaggerated in our perceptions and in the perceptions of others, perhaps? And was the USSR, in fact, much less of an obstacle to American domination of the region than it may have seemed to some? My inclination is towards the latter conclusion, and I'll tell you why I say that. The Middle East, like most other major arenas of Cold War rivalry, was immediately adjacent to the frontiers of the Soviet Union. There were no such Cold War battlefields, with the exception of Cuba and latterly Nicaragua, in the immediate vicinity of the US. In other words, most of the Cold War was fought on the periphery of the Soviet Union. We were containing them. They weren't containing us. We were up in their faces. They were not, as it were, up in ours. Of course, the United States has and has always had the luxury of a greater degree of isolation from the rest of the world than any other power in history because of our geographic situation. We have oceans and Canadians and Mexicans around us. We don't have great powers. We don't have anybody or anything that can threaten us, at least not until the era of intercontinental ballistic missiles and intercontinental terror. Nothing could threaten us. Moreover, except for an abortive Soviet attempt to deploy intermediate-range ballistic missiles in Cuba, which was foiled by John Kennedy during the '61 Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviet Union was never able to place strategic weapons. In fact, it was never able to even attempt to place strategic weapons in close proximity to the US mainland, not until the era of submarine-launched ballistic missiles. The United States was able to do this from the very first instance of the Cold War in 1945. Indeed, many historians have argued that the dropping of atomic bombs on two cities in Japan, on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, was at least in part aimed as a warning to the USSR of these American strategic capabilities. Even after the Soviets detonated their own atomic bomb in '49, they had no assured delivery system for this bomb until the deployment of intercontinental range ballistic missiles in the mid-1960s, after which both powers became capable of destroying one another. These are all indications, nevertheless, of the great superiority of the United States over the Soviet Union, a superiority that was essentially based on our country's far greater economic power and its alliances with European and Japanese economies, which by themselves already produced more than the Soviet economy only a decade after they'd been destroyed in World War II. So Allied economies together were even bigger than the Soviet economy, and our economy was many times bigger. That was the basis of American superiority. To be sure, the USSR also had its advantages. It had vast land armies, commanded in the first decades after World War II by combat-hardened commanders. It had an initial ideological advantage in much of the developing world in the face of the persistence of European colonialism. We've seen something of how this ideological edge operated in the Middle East, briefly, although we now realize it to have in fact been in operation. In sum, although the USSR was a great power, the greatest of powers after the United States, by far the greatest after the United States, in many respects it was not truly a superpower. In many respects it was not a global power of the level of the United States, lacking the global reach which the United States enjoyed with its fleets and air forces deployed everywhere, its far-flung military bases, and the interlocking and interdependent capitalist economies. All of these factors can be seen operating in the Middle East, and this is the strategic point I really think is important to understanding a lot of what was going on there, especially in the 60s and the 70s. Because in that region and in the seas around the Middle East, a subterranean, or rather a submarine struggle was waged for well over a decade and a half. This took place first in the Mediterranean, when the US Navy in the early 60s started to base Polaris-firing intermediate-range ballistic missile submarines, which could target the Soviet Union there. And the Soviets, in response, sought naval and air bases to counter them. The struggle, which we think of as between the Arabs and the Israelis, was really a struggle over these strategic weapons. The Soviets trying to, the United States basing at Rota in Spain a whole squadron of these Polaris missile submarines, and the Soviets desperately trying in Syria and Egypt and Albania and elsewhere to establish naval and air bases to counter them. This whole process could be seen again in the 1970s, when the United States deployed longer-range Poseidon submarine-launched ballistic missile-carrying submarines, which could also target the Soviet Union, but much deeper in the Soviet Union, and thereby in the Persian Gulf, in the Arabian Sea, in the Red Sea, and in the Indian Ocean, turning these areas into a similar theater for both superpowers. The point here is that it was the United States that was taking the initiative in the Middle East, in the Middle Eastern backyard of the USSR with lethal strategic weapons, and not vice versa. And it was this strategic struggle which mattered most to both of them, rather than what the Arabs or the Israelis or the Saudis and the Egyptians did. Thus, I would argue that while the struggle for influence in the Middle East seesawed back and forth, it was the United States that always had the upper hand, as became apparent with the defection to the American side of formerly radical Arab nationalist regimes, like that of Egypt under Sadat, and later that of Iraq under Saddam during the Iran-Iraq War, when Iraq was a close ally and protege of the United States. The United States applies to every other radical Arab nationalist regime: Algeria, Libya, the Sudan, North Yemen, Egypt, Iraq. Every single one of them was fundamentally anti-communist, and none were committedly anti-capitalist, though they called themselves, in some cases, socialist. The attraction of Middle Eastern rulers to both sides in the Cold War was purely based on power. And as it became apparent to many Middle Eastern elites that the United States was in fact far more powerful than the Soviet Union, they tended to gravitate towards it. Even the repulsion exercised by Washington's constantly increasing bias. You think it can't get greater, but every administration takes it higher. Even the repulsion exercised by Washington's constantly increasing bias in favor of Israel was not enough to alienate most Arab governments. We have seen this in the case of Saudi Arabia. It was equally true of Jordan, Morocco, Tunisia, and other reliable pro-American regimes. And after Sadat's apostasy from Arab nationalism, it was increasingly clear that there were no longer any red lines in this regard, and that the United States could have its Israeli cake and eat whatever it wanted in the Arab world, too. Finally, there remains the question, and it is an important question, of whether the Bush administration's unilateral and interventionist policies in the Middle East, starting with the invasion, occupation, and regime change carried out in Iraq, are an aberration and an anomaly, and whether we will therefore see the pendulum swing back to a less aggressive, less assertive, less intrusive American policy in the Middle East after January 2009. Alternatively, are the occupations of Afghanistan and Iraq the beginning of a new era in American hegemony in the Middle East? As a historian, I am very reluctant to make a prediction. In fact, I often say that the job description of historian does not include predicting the future, so you can look elsewhere for that. But I would suggest, reluctant though I am to predict anything, that on the one hand, there are both institutional factors, bureaucratic factors, budgetary factors, and a powerful element of inertia at work here, which would seem to militate in favor of a much larger, long-term American military presence in the Middle East than was possible or likely before George W. Bush became our nation's president. The illogic, indeed the absurdity, of destroying regimes and occupying countries to deal with amorphous transnational terrorist networks, of using a military machine that costs, at current budget estimates, $670 billion annually to chase after a few thousand clandestine operatives. The illogic and indeed the absurdity of this has occurred to many, even to many politicians who vote for these bloated military budgets. But the seductive siren song of the war on terror, quote unquote, has mesmerized many Americans. And opposing this war on terror terrifies most politicians. So this may well prolong the agony brought on by the current heavy American footprint in the Middle East. On the other hand, losing wars have a political logic of their own. We've seen this in Vietnam with both France and the United States. Iraq may well soon have the same effect, turning public opinion against foolish and ill-conceived military adventures abroad and forcing our Congress to do its much neglected constitutional duty of acting to check and balance the bloated imperial executive that has arisen in what Daniel Yergin called the national security state bred by the Cold War. Cut back slightly in the wake of Vietnam through FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Supervision Act, through the Pike Committee, the Boland Amendment, the War Powers Act, and other acts of legislative courage, this vampire of bloated imperial executive arrogance has arisen again. It raised its head first in the Reagan administration with Iran-Contra and other illegal attempts to subvert the intent of Congress, carried out incidentally by people who are paragons of the present administration in spite of their indictment and conviction as felons for lying to Congress. They're all back, all 3 or 4 of them, Poindexter and Abrams and so forth. It has risen again, this vampire, in the current administration, in the shape of Dick Cheney and his former colleague Donald Rumsfeld, who were never reconciled to the downsizing of executive branch prerogatives in the 1970s during this post-Vietnam phase I mentioned, and who have been having their revenge on all the rest of us ever since. I would suggest that the outcome of this decades-old struggle for a constitutional balance between the executive and the legislature, backed by those citizens who would try to restrain the executive and its actions in the world, the outcome of this struggle will determine not only whether the United States will continue to play the kind of overweening role in the Middle East that it's played since the end of the Cold War, and especially since George W. Bush became president. The outcome of this struggle may also determine whether the United States will revert in some measure to being a republic, responsive to the wishes of its citizens, and first among equals among the nations of the globe, or whether it will continue to become even more of an empire, ignoring the wishes of its own citizens and those of other peoples in the world. Thank you very much. Can I take questions myself? Should I take questions myself? Absolutely. Okay. I'm happy to handle my own questions. I don't know who the troublemakers in the audience are anyway, so. Ma'am. Yes, you. Unless you're not ma'am. I'm sorry, yes. Could you come to the microphone? I guess just line up behind the microphone, but let her go first. Sure. Please. I called on her.
Hi.
Hi.
First of all, I can't resist the temptation to emphasize what a privilege it is to hear you speak.
You're very
on
kind.
Our campus. So we owe it, I think, both to Maryland and others on campus, and also to your daughter.
I'll pass that on to her tomorrow.
Okay, right. I have 2 questions. One is basically historical, and it might be my failing memory. The other one is political. The first one you mentioned about lack of interest or institutional knowledge in the United States as far as Palestine was concerned up to the middle of the Second World War too. And if I if I remember correctly, in 1930s there was a commission of some Americans who were drawing papers, and they were thinking about the future of Palestine. And they actually had a recommendation written down. I don't know whether I'm confusing it with the white papers, whether white papers had anything to do with the American Commission.
No, those were British.
It was all British.
Papers, yeah.
So Americans in 1930s had not sent any representatives to the region.
Well, you're maybe thinking of the King-Crane Commission that went there after World War I.
Yes.
At the behest of the peace conference in
yes,
Paris.
Between the 2 wars, I mean.
That was right after World War I.
Right at it. So what was the role? So then, what role did the United States
I can talk about
see for itself there? And the second question, which is political, is that it's directly related to Palestine and Israel, and not within this broad Cold War conflict that you have been talking about. There was very recently an article written, scholarly article, trying to demonstrate the role that the Israeli lobby has on determining American foreign policy. And this article was attacked by many, many people from different quarters, including some who have been basically speaking up for the rights of Palestinians to statehood. And I was somewhat confused about the attacks coming from all different quarters in this regard. And it seems to me that it's attempting to downplay the role that the Israeli lobby has in this country in a sense, keeping our foreign policy hostage to the needs of the Israeli lobby. And the most recent indication of it being that now Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama are competing against each other to get the support of AIPAC and other Israeli lobby. So this cannot, in my mind, it really does not explain this attack on people who try to show that there is actually, we are actually a hostage of Israeli lobby in a sense.
I'm not sure I see a question there, but let me try and address it. Let me certainly address the first question. The United States played a very active role in and immediately after World War I. You will recall that President Wilson had to deal with an extremely isolationist public in this country, which didn't want any part of European wars. We had a large population of German Americans who did not want to see the United States fighting Germany. There's a large body of Irish Americans who loathed British imperialism and could not abide the idea of the United States fighting alongside the British. And it was only unrelenting German submarine warfare that finally enabled the president to drag the country, kicking and screaming, into World War I. Once it was there, however, President Wilson, in a speech in December 1917, which he enunciated the 14 points, changed the whole tone of international discourse by talking about an international organization, which was to become the League of Nations, and by talking about the idea of self-determination. This forced the colonial powers, the British and the French, to pretend, because they could not have won the war without the United States, to go along with Wilson. And this explains what happened to the King-Crane Commission, because when Clemenceau and Lloyd George and Wilson were sitting in Paris, gritting their teeth, the British and the French said, all right, you can ask these people who they want to have for a mandatory in the Middle East. The French actually reneged on that. They said, no, we don't want to ask them. We're going to impose a mandatory power on them. The mandates were the device that the League of Nations agreed upon, whereby these peoples were to enjoy, of the Arab world, the former parts of the Ottoman Empire, were to enjoy self-determination. The British went along with it, refused to send anybody, and so the team ended up being an American team. Charles Crane and, I forget his name, King, first name. He was a college president at Ohio, I don't remember. Crane was the man whose name you see when you flush a toilet. Same fellow. The same family, anyway. His family owned that sanitary ware manufacturer. But that inquiry into what people wanted went nowhere. And the story is very interesting and worth telling, and I won't bore you with it right now because it's a very long one. Lord Balfour, in a memo that he wrote secretly in 1919, said, you know, this commission went out and asked people what they want, but the powers have no intention of doing what they say. We're going to do exactly as we please, particularly in the case of Palestine. And they did. In fact, when President Wilson became sick, went back to the United States, failed to get the League of Nations treaty passed by the Senate, the United States disappeared from international diplomacy, except for things to do with arms control and money. The United States almost is absent in most of the 20s and the 30s. And it's only the same kind of presidential effort to drag a reluctant country kicking and screaming back into war, which, together with Pearl Harbor, that led us into World War II in it all. So the United States emerges, plays a role, an important role during and immediately after World War I, and then disappears. So that's the answer. How about one question per person? And then if you're all satisfied, you can come back and ask a second question.
Okay. I guess mine is a question/clarification. If the point of rethinking the Cold War is, as you suggest, to show a continuity between America's power as sort of, the hegemonic power in the world, then given that now we don't even have, sort of the, window dressing of another superpower, then its resolution or its future, you suggest, is based on how internal politics are going to shape up. That is, you were saying...
Internal politics here?
Yeah, because you were saying it's the contest between the legislative versus the executive branch versus the people who will determine whether the United States continues to be a global hegemon and what happens to its role in the Middle East.
Or how it is a global
Or how, right. And whether it continue, as you suggested, and maybe whether inertia and bureaucratic stuff will suggest that it might be there for another 10 years or 20 years. Hopefully not. But if that's the case, then how does rethinking the Cold War really help? So I guess I'm saying that there's a contradiction somewhat in my mind to your thesis.
I'll tell you where I'm trying to go with this. Because if, in fact, the United States was infinitely more powerful than the Soviet Union, then much that we were told about things that the United States had to do then, and money that we had to spend then, and bases that we had to have then, may in fact have to be rethought. And that in turn should make us rethink what we're doing today. In other words, I don't think you can just say, you can't fight the war on terror with $225 million F-A-22 fighter bombers. You can't fighter bomb a terrorist. Completely useless. That's $225 million. Actually, those planes were designed to defeat the Soviet Air Force, which doesn't exist, hasn't existed for 18 years. So one of the things I'm trying to say is maybe we should think about those kinds of continuities. Maybe the posture that the United States had in the world then had to do with misconceptions, and maybe, therefore, we should rethink the conceptions on the basis of which we have a certain posture in the world. The other two things that I would say is that these kinds of great power considerations quite often have a terrible corrosive impact on things in the countries where we're operating. I tried to give very brief examples during the Cold War, and I think the post-Cold War period will show us many other examples. I think we may be on the brink of a Sunni-Shia sectarian war, which would have been inconceivable before we invaded Iraq. No such thing was possible. No such thing could have been dreamed of. No such thing would have happened. It now seems a terrible possibility. This is one among many, many examples of awful, awful, awful consequences within the domestic politics of Lebanon and Yemen and Iraq and Iran and Pakistan, which would have not happened but for this specific exercise of American power, which we were sold on the basis of the war on terror. So war on communism, war on terror, war on whatever, but we have to spend several $100 billion, and we have to be everywhere. And I would argue there's a continuity here, which at least we should examine. I mean, maybe everything I'm saying is false. Maybe the Soviet Union was actually much stronger than we thought. Maybe, in fact, a different conclusion can be come to about the Cold War. Maybe, in fact, you do need a $225 million per plane F-A-22. It's vital to the national security of the United States, even though the Air Force that it's supposed to achieve superiority over is rusting away and doesn't exist. Never mind, maybe it is. But at least those things, I think, have to be examined. And maybe we want the Sunnis and the Shia to cut each other's throats. Maybe that's a good thing. I doubt it myself. But at least those things should be examined. I mean, whatever we went to Iraq to do, that's one of the things that's going to happen, together with a bunch of other things in Iraq and elsewhere. So, I mean, I'm not sure that examining history tells you everything about the present and the future, but I think you're totally blind in the present and looking to the future if you haven't at least looked back and seen, well, everything we thought about this period was wrong, or we're not looking carefully enough at it. Sir?
Building on this question, there is a familiar story of what the Cold War meant for the Soviet Union, the breakup, etc. But what about the drama of victory? To what extent is the United States the victim of victory, which led to the entrenchment of the military-industrial complex and a certain self-hypnosis by military force, which the Iraq War demonstrates what is, or raises the question, what is the utility of force in the 21st century?
Is that your
it demonstrates
question?
The limits of military power. And a related question, isn't also some of this account too US focused? Shouldn't we be talking as much about the growing role of China, relationship with Saudi Arabia, new financial links, of course the China-Iran Russia connections, the rise of Dubai as a financial center, etc., etc., all of which outmaneuvers the United States has specialized in military force. 21st century, military force, very expensive, not very useful. And all the others have precisely not specialized on that. Isn't there the United States being outmaneuvered because of its own narcissistic preoccupation?
Mm-hmm. I don't really think that needs an answer, but I will comment on it. I mean, I think you made an assertion rather than ask a question. Well, nominally. But no, let me comment on it. You're taking the same line that Emanuel Wallerstein does in a wonderful article he wrote in Foreign Policy magazine called "The Eagle Has Crashed," I think, and where he argues exactly as you're arguing, that this focus on force is probably going to bring American power down much faster than would otherwise be the case. And he says this on the basis of looking at longue durée history. I mean, he normally looks at cycles of hundreds of years in the work he does, sort of Brodelian longue durée type history. And I mean, this may or may not be true. It's hard for me to say. I don't like to predict the future, to tell you the honest truth. I would say, though, that one of the things that the Cold War proves is that you can spend a rival into the ground with military expenditures. The United States, you can spend a rival into the ground. The United States was capable with suffering, I mean, it cost suffering to the United States and to its economy and to its budget to spend money on utterly useless weapon system. It helped to destroy the Soviet Union. The second thing I would say is that the worst thing you can do with force, with military power, is to use it. The Soviets learned that to their terrible dismay in Afghanistan. I mean, the Red Army had basically only been used to put down minor revolts in Eastern Europe between World War II and Afghanistan. And when they actually used it, they lost it. Same thing happened to us in Vietnam, and the same thing is happening to us in Iraq. We can't win that war. Our military is completely unsuited to fighting the kind of war that we're trying to fight. And in fact, you can't win that kind of war. That's just unwinnable, in my view. Colonial wars, you can't win. You can hang on for an unlimited amount of time as long as you want to sacrifice young men and sacrifice money and weapon systems. You can't win it. The British and the French were fighting a constant colonial war in most of their possessions for most of their imperial histories. And the United States has never really fought a colonial war of this sort since the Philippines. Because American hegemony wasn't exercised in that way throughout the Cold War. The post-Cold War period is remarkable in that the United States has suddenly reverted to a type which doesn't really, it's not very common in our own history, except for, you might argue, some Caribbean and Central American and Philippine examples, but which is very common in European history, and which is doomed. I mean, by its very nature. You can't go in and restructure a society from the ground up by armed force. You can't do it. It's simply impossible. You can destroy it. You can defeat it. You can defeat a state, but you can't do what we're trying to do in the case of Iraq. It's undoable. And the Egyptians learned that in Yemen, as did many other powers in many other places. You can destroy it. That's what you certainly can do with power, but you can't do what we're trying to do. So, I mean, I subscribe to some elements of your thesis, but the rest of it is untestable. We'll see. Time will tell. Sir.
There's a tension in your remarks between the idea that oil is a strategic commodity, the Middle East is a strategic region, and that this is all a question of inertia. Mm-hmm. With oil at record prices and the U.S. economy roaring and China and India doing fine and Europe okay as well, and the U.S. military spending using about 3% of U.S. oil consumption, should we be very specific about the fact that this is really a question of inertia? And if so, from an historian's perspective, when did the switchover come? Did it come in 1945 with Hiroshima? Did it come in the Cuban Missile Crisis? Yeah. Or did it come when stagflation was beat after Carter?
Insofar as oil is concerned.
Well, but then the whole question, I mean, the other thing you mentioned was weapons platforms.
Yeah.
But that's also irrelevant and has been for a long time. Yeah. So if it's the case that the Middle East is not, in fact, strategically important, when did that happen?
When did it become strategic?
When did it become unimportant strategically?
Would you just run through that question one more time for me?
Well,
actually now got
the point is that the Middle East is not, that region is not important for strategic weapons platforms proximity.
Not anymore.
Of course. And the question is oil actually strategically important given the series of things I've okay, and if it's not strategically important anymore, when did it stop being so?
Okay. three things. You're absolutely right about strategic weapons platforms. That stops in the 70s with intercontinental ballistic missiles and with much longer range submarine-launched ballistic missiles. However, there are other elements to strategy than strategic weapons and weapons platforms. One of them, in the eyes of many policymakers in this administration, apparently, has to do with the sense that it behooves the United States to dominate a region which is in between all the other potential great powers that could challenge the United States. Now, this may be a benighted view. I myself take a very dim view of it. I don't think that people who say this understand anything. But it may well be that this is one of the elements driving their policy. The idea that between a rising China, a rising India, a potentially resurgent Russia, and a Europe that doesn't always do what we want, to be in this region of the world, Middle East and Central Asia, to dominate its energy supplies, is strategically vital for the 21st century. Now, I could critique this view until the cows come home. I'm in a region of the country where the cows do come home, actually, unlike Manhattan, where I live now. Firstly, because I think that some of the things that you say about oil are actually right. And it is, in fact, the case that the people who produce the stuff can't eat it. They can't sit on it. They have to sell it. And so it's really a commodity. And you can get advantages for companies insofar as a commodity is concerned, i.e. the big oil companies to whom certain figures in this administration just might be beholden will make out like absolute bandits if they have the exclusive pirate-like access to Iraqi oil that they will get if the Iraqi oil bill, which was written in English, by the way, not in Arabic, had to be translated into Arabic so that the Iraqi assembly could consider it. It was written in Washington. It was written by energy companies, written by people in the administration who worked for energy companies before they temporarily took jobs in the administration. It was then sent out to Iraq, translated into Arabic, and fed to the assembly, which may or may not pass it, in fact. This won't have really much to do with the position of the United States vis-a-vis other countries. It will have a lot to do with whether it's ExxonMobil, or it's BP, or it's a Russian or a Chinese or another company that gets the commercial advantage. And unfortunately for some people in our government, these things are impossible to distinguish. What is in their personal financial interest and that of their country club buddies is to them the national interest of the United States. But in fact, it might not be. In fact, it may be that no matter who controls the countries in which this oil is produced, they are going to sell it, they have to sell it, and it'll be mainly market factors and other things like cartels of producers that'll determine price. So I think the Middle East, waxes and wanes in terms of its strategic importance. It was particularly important when Britain was in India. It became less important when Britain left India. It became particularly important with a certain set of classes of nuclear weapons. It became less important. But because it is where it is, it's always going to be probably the most strategically important region in the world, or one of them. But that doesn't mean it'll always be that'll be an important factor in every administration or for every power that borders the Middle East. And I think that now the question really may be inertia. I mean, there is no logic to the current profile of the United States in that region, in my view.
Comment that it's been pointed out by various people, of course, that it's not the oil itself, it's the control of oil, especially with rising powers like China and India, and even Europe, for example, being somewhat dependent on having access to the Middle East. And if the United States has a sufficient presence there, a military presence, which is exerting leverage on those countries, it has control. It's a matter of control. Anyway, my question is
Can I speak to that, and then I'll let you answer. Then I'll let you ask your question. I mean, one of the interesting things about oil is that oil wasn't controlled by the producing countries until the late 60s and 70s. It was controlled by the companies. The oil producing the companies, the so-called Seven Sisters, they're down to 5. There'll be 2 of them in a few years, probably, or 3. The oil companies decided everything about oil. It would be produced, it would not be produced. It would be produced in what quantities, it would be produced in what qualities, it would be refined or not refined, how much money would be paid to the producing country, if any, whether a country would be allowed to produce or not. The British wanted the oil concession in 1933 so they could not produce oil in Saudi Arabia. They wanted to give Ibn Saud a little bit of money and not produce. They did not want to challenge the production coming out of Iraqi and Iranian fields. These kinds of decisions and an extraordinarily low price and extraordinarily high profits for the companies were entirely determined by the cartel for the first 60-odd years of production of oil in the Middle East. Since then, those choices have been largely taken by the countries that produce through an oil producers cartel rather than a company cartel, OPEC. The cartel has less power because it has a smaller share of production, but it's still enormously powerful. Now, what seems to me, the Iraqi oil law seems to me the first proof we have of this, to have been the thinking of this administration, is an American presence in this country, in these countries, will enable us to dictate the kind of oil laws which we could only dream of for 40 years, where the companies decided, and therefore not selling oil to a country, or not producing, or producing at a certain level, and making obscene, even more obscene profits became possible. I would suggest that that's thinking that has no place in the 21st century. There's no country that's going to allow that to happen. Sooner or later, any legislator who votes for that kind of thing in Iraq will find herself or himself not a legislator. Very simply, those laws are not going to stand. You can't go back. They could try and pass them. They may pass. They may be able even to produce for a year or two, but those things won't last. So these are people who dream of the good old days when Standard Oil existed as a single company and it dictated everything about oil all over the world. You can read Jürgen's book, The Prize, if you want to get back. Now your question. I'm sorry.
Yeah, my question is a much more minor one. You mentioned the fact that the Saudis demanded or requested, I don't know what word you use, that Palestine be not forgotten in the tractations that were going on at that time, but you never came back to that.
Yeah.
And I would be interested, what you did is, of course, is paint Palestine as kind of a pawn in the big power struggle, but I wanted you to come back to that and follow that up, because anyway, that's my
Okay. Well, I alluded to it briefly by saying that what the Saudis eventually decided was that this was going to be an irritant that they would put up with, because it was more important to have this bilateral relationship with the United States. And they have unceasingly tried to get the United States to, keep to a commitment to fairness and at least consultation with the Arabs, and have consistently failed. What we now see is a slightly more assertive Saudi monarchy. This happens once every 3 decades. So Ibn Saud was slightly assertive. His son Faisal, 20 years later, was slightly assertive. This current king is slightly assertive, which is clearly going beyond anything that this administration or previous administrations would have been willing to do on Palestine, but by no means treating this as if it was more important than the bilateral relationship. So for Saudi Arabia, certainly, and for most Arab governments, Palestine is important, partly because their public opinion considers it important, and partly because they understand perfectly well that this is a continuing source of tension that they'd like to get rid of. And finally, because they think that the American policy is stupid. It simply harms the United States and harms them, not to speak of harming Israel. Not that these people are worried about Israel per se, but they just don't see it. But that they will tolerate whatever bias the United States exhibits simply because the bilateral relationship with Washington is more important. And I could go chapter and verse, decade by decade, through how different Arab countries came to this conclusion. But it is, I think, true of the vast majority of Arab regimes today. It wasn't at a certain point, it has become. Ken?
Yeah.
This is the last question? Okay.
Can't help giving you a hard time. Thanks for a very interesting talk, and at least for me, a very persuasive argument. But in light of that, and this in a sense relates to Mort's question, if somebody who wasn't here asked me what did Khalidi have to say, I would partially sum it up by saying, well, you decentered the Arab-Israeli conflict from the history of the past 60-odd years of the Middle East. And given that most Americans, if they know anything about the Middle East, that's what they know. In fact, I don't know how many people I'll talk to.
That's what they think they know.
They'll refer to the Middle Eastern conflict or just the Middle East, and they mean Israel and something else. Okay, so have we been looking at the region through the wrong end of the telescope for 60-odd years? And if so, then how would you re-narrate that period?
Well, in a way, that's what I'm trying to do with this project, which the lecture was part of. I really do think that this is what obsessed policymakers, at least. I'm not sure it always drove events. I mean, quite frequently, it was this Palestinian faction or this Arab government or that Israeli minister who actually drove events. So I'm not saying outcomes were determined by the rivalry. I'm simply saying this is what drove the policy. This is what, or these were the considerations that were foremost in the minds of the policymakers, whatever crises they were forced to respond to. And it was true of the Soviets as well as of the Americans. The Soviets were obsessively concerned with the United States. I would argue they did not really care very much about specific outcomes in specific Arab countries, even though they wanted to see socialist regimes, they wanted the Arab communist parties to be strong, they wanted a certain set of outcomes, but the thing that was the most important was countering the Americans, by far the most important. And if they had to choose between an Arab nationalist regime that persecuted and tortured to death its communists, but would do what the Soviet Union wanted strategically, and supporting a communist party, invariably they chose the first, without exception. Torture your communists, we don't care, just give us bases. And that was the same was true of our policy, basically. Graham, what's his name? Graham Fuller, who used to be National Intelligence Officer and Vice Chair of the National Intelligence Council of the United States, and who was the only person fired for Iran-Contra, even though he had advised against it, which is very interesting. Elliott Abrams, Admiral Poindexter, Negroponte, they floated to the top, nothing happened. They were finally indicted and convicted, some of them, but certainly the Reagan administration never punished them. Fuller was fired from the CIA. But he said in a lecture that he gave at the Wilson Center in Washington once, that he was an analyst, essentially, but he'd lived in many of these Middle Eastern countries and observed them closely as a hands-on American spook. I mean, this was his job. He said, all we cared about was the Russians. If the Russians disappeared, we didn't care about a country anymore. And if the Russians were there, that's all we cared about. And he said, when the Cold War ended, places like Ethiopia, places like Yemen, and he mentioned a half dozen countries in this lecture, suddenly they ceased to be important because the strategic concerns having to do with straits and bases and naval and air and so on and so forth, subversion and so on and so forth, suddenly ceased to be. We didn't care one bit about them in and of themselves. And I would say that about the Arab-Israeli conflict. I try and, when I teach modern Middle East history, I try and tell this to my students, and they're as obsessed about Arab-Israeli things as everybody else. And they think that this is the be-all and end-all of Middle East politics. Well, it's obviously important and it has a dynamic of its own. But if you don't understand it in terms of the way that it fitted in, for a period at least, to the Cold War, you're missing a lot of really important things about the Arab-Israeli conflict, including the fact that the way these wars were fought and the enormous destructiveness of them had more to do with the Soviets and the Americans being forced by this rivalry into higher and higher levels of weapon systems. We were sending F-4 Phantoms to Israel during the War of Attrition at a time when the Navy and the Marines were using them as their frontline fighter and attack bomber. And they were being shot down over Vietnam. Senator McCain was in one of them. And the production at St. Louis, the factory of McDonnell Douglas, was not great enough to sustain the amount of planes that were being shot down over Vietnam and the number of planes that were being shot down over the Suez Canal. And that's one of the reasons that the Israelis had to accept a ceasefire. And the Rogers Plan was implemented in 1970, because we could not supply them with enough planes, given that we were losing as many as we were losing in Vietnam. The Soviets, at the same time, had pilots flying MiG-21Js against these Phantoms and having them shot down, and it was driving the Soviets crazy. They sent in air defense crews. Hundreds of Soviet personnel were killed in the War of Attrition. It's a fact. Fighting in Egypt. They weren't, bystanders. They were manning anti-aircraft sites. They were advising Egyptian crews manning anti-aircraft sites. Then the Israelis were bombing the bejesus out of them and killing them, mainly Egyptians, obviously. Tens of thousands of Egyptians are killed in this same period. This is very important to understanding this war. Just to say the Arabs and the Israelis, it's like missing this huge important element. It doesn't necessarily determine outcomes. In fact, it was the success of the Egyptians in shooting down slightly more planes than the Americans were able to supply the Israelis with. Then Egyptians were killed by the Israeli bombing that led to the outcome which eventually allowed Sadat to cross the canal. because the Egyptians were able to push their missiles up to the canal and thereby have an area on the eastern side of the canal where Israeli troops were, where they could shoot down Israeli planes. That's why the 73 war happened as it happened. And that had more to do with, the Egyptians managing to do what they did and the Israelis not managing to do what they were trying to do. But the weapon systems are very important. And the reasons that these superpowers do what they do is very, very important.
Do we have another minute or?
The man wants a follow-up.
What was the, I didn't hear the answer.
You're the chair. Sure, one more quick one.
In light of your answer to my question, which did reiterate your main argument, then can I ask you to come back to the question about the Israel lobby or the debate thereover, which you forgot?
I mean, I'm not sure what I can say about the Israel lobby. I mean, anybody who doesn't see it has got to be blind. And I'm baffled by the critique of this book. All you have to do is read what AIPAC actually says about itself. We are the most powerful. We bring people to Capitol Hill on X day when we see 535 senators and congressmen. I mean, they talk about it themselves. Hello? I mean, I'm not quite sure what's missing from the picture. I know you said, why are there critiques? Why are there critiques from the left?
Why Chomsky
I'll answer
attacks
you.
it? You know,
I'll answer you.
Yeah,
I'll answer you.
it
I didn't want to answer you. I'll answer you.
Yeah, because
I got it. Don't ask another question.
I wasn't trying to just comment. There was a genuine question in
I
the
understand
comment.
that, and I didn't want to answer it. I'll answer it, just to stop this. If you read the detailed argument put forward by Stephen Walt and John Mearsheimer in not the London Review of Books article, but the much longer study which was posted on the Harvard website, the CFIA website at Harvard, you will see a number of assertions relating to Iraq and a number of assumptions relating to Iraq and other things, and a number of assumptions about what drives American policy. That's what Chomsky was disputing. He wasn't disputing that the lobby is powerful. He wasn't disputing most of what they're arguing about. He was disputing what he considers very important, that there is something more important than the lobby, which Mearsheimer and Walt don't accept. They have, firstly, because they have an IR framework. Secondly, because they accept certain assumptions about American power. And thirdly, because they I think, make certain arguments about the distinction between foreign policy making and the legislative branch, or elide certain distinctions, which they probably shouldn't do. And so many of the critiques are critiques of detail about this or that aspect of the argument, rather than the overall argument. And if you read them carefully, you'll see that. To the people who make them, I'm sure they're very important. I don't see that that has very much to do with the value of the critique. And I think that the response to it from the other side is the most interesting, actually. Why are people howling so loud, given that so much of this is self-evident to anybody who actually follows the lobby? And by the lobby, I mean primarily AIPAC, but other groups that are associated with it. There are other problems with this, which they say they're going to fix in the book that it's coming out from Farrar, Straus, and Giroux in a few months. They're publishing a much more amplified version of the argument, which presumably will speak to their critics to the left, their critics from the friends of the lobby and from elsewhere. So you'll be able to get it from the horse's mouth rather than from me.